G'day folks. Talk to Dr Dani Larkin, a proud Bundjalung Kungarykany woman and the Deputy Director and Lecturer at the Indigenous Law Centre in UNSW, the university down in Sydney. And she contributed to the Uluru Statement. Super important. Yarn about the essence of it, what it represents, what it is, break it down, how it started, what was involved, where it is now, and where it's going. Especially with the announcement from the new federal government that was just voted in. Interesting times ahead. And yarn about Dr. Dani's trajectory. For life. Fierce advocate. Doing solid work. Love the yarn. And if you like the podcast, hit that subscribe or follow button. And we've also got a Patreon page. The link is within the description. So if you want to roll with the squad and become a patron, that'd be great. And want to thank our sponsors, Permobil Australia, the greatest electric wheelchairs in the land. Wouldn't be sitting in anything else but these four wheels right here, and they've got great assistive tech also. So righto, let's get into it. Dr. Dani Larkin, Deputy Director and Lecturer for the Indigenous Law Centre at UNSW, uni there down in New South Wales in Sydney. Thanks a lot for jumping on the podcast and having a yarn.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, like I said just before off camera, I think it's super important to really have a yarn about some of the work that you've done and being a contributor. We've contributed to the Uluru Statement. And I just really wanted to like jump in and break down like what that is. But there's a few things before we break it down and go into the essence of what it is and some of the people behind it and what it means. I just really want to find out, who you are and where's your mob from.
Yeah. So I'm Dani Larkin. I'm a Bundjalung and Kungarykany woman. I grew up on Bundjalung country in northern New South Wales, in Grafton, and in a little Aboriginal community just outside of Grafton called Bundjalung. And yeah, I was really privileged, I suppose, in a way, to be born into a family that is, so proud of and so deeply connected with my Aboriginal cultural identity. And, I had very prominent grandparents, great grandparents who have been heavily involved in, Indigenous political activism within Australia. My great grandfather is Jack Patton, who was a huge civil rights activist in the 1930s and one of the main prominent leaders of, the Aborigines Progressive Association. So, I've had a lot of strong, powerful Black influences around me that have really, um, you know, shaped the way in which, I interact with my culture and with the law and this system as my own person. And I think that's really important. And unfortunately, that's not everyone's story and privilege in our culture. There's a lot of disconnect and dispossession there. So I feel really grateful that that's where I come from.
Yeah, that's a lot that you can draw upon there. Where you're talking about old Unk there back in the 1930s, where like, and that's solid. Like when you're going back decades, and where that's through generations, that's just come through your family. So, is it fair to say like coming like through where is it just family that you really draw that upon, or who are some of the other influences that growing up that you've brought into the fold that's manifested within yourself to because I can just tell, and just talking to you now, and when we've had talks off camera, just how passionate you are. So, who are some of the other mob out there that have really, gained weight to, the path that you've taken?
Yeah, I'm inspired by all Indigenous leaders, and not just those that we all know, and see within books and media and interviews. I'm inspired by leaders out at Bar Yugal, particularly my aunties and the women out there. I'm inspired by even my great grandma's work. Who didn't have the sort of spotlight as like my great grandfather Jack Patton, but she really showed this strength and resilience in my family and just for community out there, of what it means to be, an Aboriginal woman and rearing kids and trying to shape them and mold them into being really strong, proud Indigenous leaders. But I look to my aunties out there. I look to my uncles out there in my community. I'm inspired by the resilience of our young people and our children. I'm inspired by, those that are even in the youth Uluru dialogue group, and their confidence and activism as young, up and coming, generational change makers. And I think, I look around and I look at, Megan Davis and the work she's done, Noel Pearson, and, our new Indigenous Affairs Minister, Linda Burney, and just
Hey,
her grace, her integrity. I love her style of leadership. I think, she really is so connected with our issues as a peoples. And
100%.
I think she'll do amazing things for us. So there's a lot of different people,
And
mob
what
that
about outside of Australia? Like, what about other mob? If I was going to reach out to say if it's, African Americans or Europe, or if you're looking at if are there a powerful few that you've also drawn upon, Canadian Aboriginals or Inuits or other mob also, that you'd want to sort of mold into the mix, that has sort of helped some of the facets of what you do?
Definitely. I mean, I've met some amazing scholars. At the start of 2021, I just sort of moved to Sydney and, I had just started working at UNSW and was given an amazing opportunity to present some of my research and my work at a United Nations forum. And I was really inspired by, the conversations we were having around self determination and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I'm inspired by, First Nations of Canada. Much of my research intersects with looking at, the situation over in New Zealand and Canada, so the Maori, and I'm really inspired by, the different ways in which Indigenous peoples from around the world, are trying to champion change through structural reform and the way in which they pass that on to their young people. So, I mean, yeah, it doesn't stop from just Australia. I look abroad a lot with my research, and I'm constantly trying to prioritize, giving voice and platform and citation to Indigenous scholars from around the world when I write, because that's where authority comes from. You write on Indigenous issues and you research them, you prioritise Indigenous scholarly voices in your referenced work. So I look at their work, I read it, and, of course, I try and integrate it into my take on things here in Australia. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
a lot of power within that, and you were spot on there where you're talking about intersectionality, and there's so many variables in there, but what that leads to, it builds up and it adds more power to the work you're doing, and you know, especially to a lot of voices out there, and where you've got the influence of social media and what people can do these days. But
yeah, definitely.
growing up, and this is something that I like touching on in regards to, if it's mob across the nation that I'm talking to, and I've had this trouble my whole life beforehand and still do today, and that's being a fair skinned Koori and having to justify my Aboriginality,
Mm,
and that's like, some of the talk where, growing up and still today, like, where it's like, what's the percentage of your Aboriginality and this, that, and other. And it's like, hey, I'm Koori, I'm Aboriginal. You don't have to be black to be black. Like, how's that been for like yourself? Because, having a yarn with you now,
Mm,
and have you gone through that justification, whether it's, been through, you
mm.
know, schooling, growing up, what you're doing now, like having those questions thrown at you, whether it's, students or whatever it may be. So how's that been for you and your life in general? Because it absolutely does my head in, and I talk to a lot of mob that go through this. So
Yeah, it's it's really really frustrating to deal with. I don't know if it'll ever stop, and I suppose this just speaks to, the ignorance of Australia's education system in properly educating, from an early age, young people as to what assimilation policies were about within Australia. And, they were all about diluting, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander blood. And it was about making people not look black.
big time.
And
Hmm.
so, it is a bit of a slap in the face for people to, not understand full Australian history in that way, and obviously be progressive and intelligent enough to logically make sense of the fact that there are many existing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people out there, like myself and yourself, who are fair skinned. Yeah, look, growing up, I'm fair skinned, freckles. I've got, you know, um, a very sort of multicultural combination within myself, like European heritage, Asian. So, I mean, look, I've grown up and it's mostly come from non-Indigenous sort of, kids, young people who haven't understood that. And it's just a systematic educational failure. But I mean, I know where I come from. Like,
Here, here.
yeah, like I grew up, I went to Bar Yeagle Primary School out on this Aboriginal community for a bit. And, we're all different shades and we're all Aboriginal. Most of us are cousins, but we never questioned anyone's identity or place of belonging. And that really speaks to the character of who we are as a peoples. But, certainly it's been tough. There's been times when I was sort of a younger adult where I was really coming into my own, and as a young woman and in law, and being fair skinned in this sort of Indigenous space when it comes to law and policy reform, and working out ways in which I engage with that and create my own sort of identity within that. Yeah, you have a bit of an identity crisis, right? And it's not so much about not knowing where you come from. You know where you come from, and I was connected to my family, and they've been, always backing me and supporting me and protecting me. But you get out into the big wide world, and yeah, you get faced with certain people, whether it's in your personal life or professional life. You dating people, and like, oh, you're Aboriginal, like, wow. And it just, like, you can see how it just changes everything for them. And you learn to develop.
Unconscious bias.
Yeah. You develop this thick skin, and it's sad, but it is, I mean, my kids in time will, when I have kids, will go through the same, and probably same for you. Um, and it sucks. I think, there's so much to change so that we're not confronted with that. But yeah, I've always found it a bit tough and uncomfortable. Now that I'm, in my own little space, and people know where I come from a bit more, and I've got a little bit more of a profile with my work with the Uluru Statement. I don't get questioned like that. Certainly not from mob. But I think you get
Well,
to a
you're
place.
established to do that within your, like, for you to be like to have contributed to that, which is super important. That's,
Yeah.
you know like where you are, where you stand within mob, and that's it. black, white, or brindle, we come in all sorts of shades. You don't, and that's been a massive driver for me, that which, perpetuates my feelings when over time growing up, when it's like, oh, you're not Korea, you're not this. It just manifests and makes myself want to reach out to
Mm,
identity and Aboriginality and mob and thirst for knowing all things Aboriginal, because you know myself, like with my grandfather's stolen generation, and
mm,
going through Kinchela Boys Home, and then just knowing what was lost, and when it's language and identity and culture, and it's trying to claw back at this, and then you're
yeah.
having these ignorant people out there that just throw shade at your identity,
Mm.
and it's like, no, no.
That's their issue at the end of the day. And you get to a place where you don't have to justify yourself to anyone, and anyone that brings into question any part of your identity, that's an issue and a matter for them to take up on their own sort of self growth and discovery and their journey in life. And then you move on, and you don't even really want to engage with people that are um, ignorant enough, and that are rude enough to bring into question, point blank, your identity, whether it's about your indigeneity or whether it's about your gender, sexuality. You get to a place where that's my place of being, and I find peace in that. And I think it's just part of growing up. I think, like with any kind of part of your identity, you just sort of know who your allies are and who aren't, and I just kind of leave people to do their own educational work and growth and move on to the next.
Yeah, 100%. And that's because, a lot of ignorant folk out there, and you can scream to the treetops, and,
Yeah.
and you've got a clear message where it gets, where it's broken down pretty well, but it
Mm,
still doesn't get through to a lot of people, and you can shake them and try and get that message in there, but it just doesn't penetrate. But,
mm.
we just got to keep moving on and just keep broadcasting,
Yeah, exactly.
our message and what it stands for, eh?
Exactly. Yeah. Some people don't want to listen, and we're used to that. A lot of our messaging falls onto deaf ears. But we're experts at getting around barriers and people like that. And so we do what we usually do as a peoples, and it's business as usual. We'll just get around you and keep progressing with our own plight to justice, however that might look.
100%. Used to these hardships. It's like keep throwing the walls up. We'll keep busting through.
Yeah.
So, with you know being Aboriginal First Nations going through, talk to us through when you're going through university, and what was that like going through uni? Because I bet you would have had a lot of healthy debates. Yeah.
Yeah, boy, did I ever. University was really interesting. So I studied at Griffith. I started off at Charles Darwin Uni up in the Northern Territory, and then I realised that no one was attending classes there really, because everyone just sort of studies from afar from home. And so that didn't work, especially if I wasn't prepared in class and I'd be the only person sitting there and be called upon to answer all these, like, really technical legal issues and questions. So I went, okay, this isn't good. I'm not prepared enough to be the only person in the class. So I went to the Gold Coast, and I went to Griffith University there for my undergrad. And yeah, it was all right. Like, I mean, I had my little clique at the Gamurray unit at Griffith University. So, um, there was only a small amount of Indigenous students when I was there, and even smaller yet again, there was only like one or two of us that were studying in this huge law degree cohort. And we really stuck together and banded together, and we would, because it was confronting for us as young people, going through and doing a law degree, and you're learning about the way in which inequality works in this legislative and policy sort of way, and that really dictates the way in which we find ourselves oppressed today, and why, we found our ancestors, oppressed back in the past. And so you're learning, at this different level, feeling quite isolated and a little alone. You know, the mechanisms that were used to, oppress my ancestors and myself, and it continues to do that. And when you learn about that machinery, it is confronting, and the delivery of it, wasn't the best at times from lecturers that taught myself and, the couple other Indigenous law students that were sort of with me, and that was really tough, and it was confronting. There were times we would walk away feeling, really deflated, frustrated, angry, um, disappointed, and hurt. It was a whole roller coaster of emotions, doing a law degree,
Yeah, and
as an
take us through a
Indigenous.
scenario. Like,
Um, I mean, specific one doesn't really come. Oh, maybe when I was learning, I think it was one of my earlier courses. So you go through foundational sort of theoretical courses when you first start, and I think, when you're learning about, principles of, equality, and you're learning about different philosophers, I think, the delivery of certain bits of content, and even just learning about, the Australian Constitution, and, how the system works,
Constitution. Yep.
when you're sitting there and you're only given a sort of white male academic's opinion that doesn't give enough context to the way in which the Constitution denied women and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, inclusion when it came to its drafting. You know,
God, that would have been frustrating when you're going through that, you know?
It was because, we grow up learning we'd go to schools, right, and you learn like the white fella way of how things are, and how we all came to be settled, and everything's great and dandy. And then you go home, and it's hard to, sit there and do homework and assignments, and, you're trying to appease someone that's your superior in the education system, in drafting responses to the content that they've taught you. But the content that
So
they've
would you
taught
get
you.
scared, like, in a way? Like, if you're putting together, like,
Mm.
certain content and obviously it's got to get marked, and it's like, yes, you want to get to the end of
Yeah.
this degree and pass in a certain way, but then you're standing up for who you are and what you believe, and
Mm.
you want that on paper.
Mm.
So would you be apprehensive at times?
Yeah, you would, because when the content in, the initial, instance of it being delivered lacks, really key, important, factual, historical, data and context, and that there's more to this story than what has been let on, when the lecture's being given, and you're trying to, contextualize things and explain them further, you don't know whether, you're going to get a good mark, because, you're challenging, different assumptions made about, the status quo and how the system's created and how it works. And you're challenging that from an Indigenous perspective. And you don't know even whether, when it is marked, and you do challenge it, if the person's going to properly, and adequately give, credit and marks to the additional stuff that you've just, given in your response, because you've gone outside of the sort of white, sterilized narrative of what you've just been taught. So the Australian Constitution is, this amazing document that's hard to change, but this is how all the different institutions it's set up. And you're like, well, it was also something that left out women and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the drafting phases, and it's, got entrenched racism within it. And so they're two different kind of perspectives of the same document. And of course, you'll get different answers, for that. So things like that were hard. You learnt pretty quick, though, how to play the game at university, and how to, I don't want to say conform, but in a way, survive and fall in.
Playing your cards, playing your cards.
Yeah, and you do internships and graduate programs afterwards. But when I was studying, I was the first Aboriginal cadet to go through the Australian Federal Police. Before myself and three other guys that were studying as well, doing their undergrads. I think they were from Sydney. Um,
Really?
yeah, we were the very first to go through as Aboriginal cadets in the Australian Federal Police, and um,
Yeah, I think that's always super important. It's like, yes, knowing who, you
yeah,
know,
like you
who
see it with
mob are, like who they are as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people, but also knowing that the land that you live on, that you're working on, and knowing that culture,
mm,
immersing in that, like it's always, you always got the thirst for knowing who you are as an individual, but knowing the land that you stand on,
yeah,
super important.
I think so. I mean, you see it with state-based police agencies, and there's MOUs that are established with Aboriginal legal services and things like that. It comes down to individual police officers in how far they truly adhere to the terms of an MOU and properly engage with legal agencies like the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Service or the Aboriginal Legal Service in New South Wales. And so, but how that's governed, by people at the top really sets the tone, that kind of leadership for how individuals, that are on the ground engaging with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in a negative and in a positive way, um, you know, interact with them and how much they do. I've seen, good and bad on both sides with that. Probably mostly bad, if I'm being honest. I've worked, in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander legal service before, and I've seen, a neglect from police officers in adhering to, if they've got an Aboriginal person in custody, calling, a caseworker from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander legal service or their lawyer. Um, so all of these things are, they require ultimately a huge cultural change, but that comes from, good leadership.
Yeah, and what's your thoughts on, because I've worked in and around with a lot of black fellas, right, that going through incarceration facilities in all sorts of different areas, and just the distrust that they'll have with ALS,
Mm,
and then they'll want representation from like some other mob, like some non-indigenous organisation, like to do with
mm,
representing to do with the law. So what do you think that boils down to? Like it's not the same with
mm,
everyone, but I see a bit of fashion of that with a lot of mob going through incarceration facilities.
yeah. To be honest, like many of our organisations that exist, I think it comes down to really a lack of funding to be able to properly resource and support, that kind of service provider. And
Boom. I'm glad you said that
yeah,
because that's 100% how I feel. And it's
yeah,
got to do with the money behind it. It needs to be a lot more.
yeah. And so, sometimes people, they get a huge caseload of, people that are either in custody, in remand, or, out on bail, whatever the case. And
It's a lot going on.
there's a lot going on, and it is really really hard, and it is frustrating at every angle, right? You know I'm so compassionate and understanding and sympathetic of Aboriginal legal service clients, and the position that they're in when perhaps they feel like things are being rushed through at times when it comes to court day, and the ALS solicitor has got like 50 files to get through and try and adjourn and move on to the mention for another date. And, it's overwhelming. And, but this is important when you are faced with coming before the court. Like it's a whole different experience, of course. And so it's this person's life. And they've, probably had the worst encounter that they'll ever have, or it's been a repeated encounter with authorities that, 9 times out of 10, we know statistically, you know, racially discriminate towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And, it's alarming the rates that of our people that come into contact with the police. But the treatment,
Huge
even after,
percentages.
is really bad. And,
Yes.
and
Ongoing treatment.
yeah,
Bad, bad, bad.
exactly. And so, the entire experience is so traumatic. And then they get to court and they've got their, ALS solicitor there that's got, 40 other different cases to get through. And you get worried and you get frustrated and you don't know whether it's them or whether it's the system and the judge that's being, unfair, because we know that there's disproportionate sentencing of, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people compared to non-Indigenous people when it comes to, terms and the lengths. And so,
And having that anxiety of that workload, like trying to chop through when really there should be good solid time taken. But,
more support,
if you don't have that, that's it. More support, more funding, more
more
money,
lawyers.
because
Yeah.
that's it. Because it's just churn and burn. It's no, and like, from what I've seen, like seeing some of the people coming through ALS, and it's
Mm.
just the workload's like pretty full on. And then,
It's intense.
where that's it.
And they're
And
trying to
well,
do the
that's it.
best
I
they
don't need to
can.
tell you that. So,
Yeah. I think people are just trying to do the best they can with the little that they have, but we all come from these different experiences and, positions. And, you know, the what you're left with is a lack of justice. From every single angle, there's a lack of justice, and from every single angle, there's frustration. I'm talking from a defense perspective, though. I don't necessarily think that that comes from like a judge's perspective generally, or even a police perspective, but I think, caseworkers that are, in service providing organisations that are trying to, deal with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that come before the courts and are, clients of Aboriginal legal services, they're in a different position yet again. And of course, again, underfunded. A lot of the time we see these, regional kind of country township service provider organizations defunded, and then another one that's kind of similar is created again, and people are just starting to build a rapport with their caseworkers and muddle their way through a really traumatic experience and really racist criminal justice system, only to get to almost the end, and then a new caseworker pops up and a new organization pops up and they have to
that's it.
retell
Or waiting on
story.
interpreters too. If you're
Yeah.
looking at remote locations, and that person only speaks English is their fourth language, and then you're gonna wait another week because that interpreter might be down and out for that week, might be sick or whatever, and then
Yeah.
things get ushered through, and then it's
Yeah.
oh man, frustrating. Yeah.
Yeah. Our well-being, emotionally, mentally, physically, needs to be far better prioritized in that system than what it is, and that is just like, you know that's key, right? I mean, nothing's really changed since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, and that report was published. And that's the constant annual critique, right? Like the statistics just get worse and worse. Our people are dying in custody. Our young people are getting, put into detention centres at alarming rates. Only a few years ago, 100% of young people in detention centres were Indigenous, every single one of them. And
100%.
100%. And so, I look at,
Do you hear that, people? 100%.
yeah,
Far out.
and then they get, out, and there's a lack of support. Like there's a lack of follow through with, mob exiting these types of institutions, right? And not enough effort in ensuring that, yeah, we're properly supported and able to contribute in a really empowered
And
way to
yeah,
society.
And what I find absolutely absurd, like where you've got, because, where I work in the disability sector and dealing with mob,
Mm.
and you look at the percentages with mob that are incarcerated, a lot of brothers and sisters, and then you're looking at the disability tag on there, which is huge.
Yeah.
And if you're looking at the intellectual, psychosocial disabilities, and where you got, say, a lot of the juniors that are coming through
Mm.
in New South Wales alone, 73% of young Indigenous kids coming through incarceration systems have got a disability. 73%. And that's New South Wales justice numbers.
Mm.
So, and that's, it's shocking. And going back to like looking at the supports coming out of prison, like when you've got someone that comes out of prison
Mm.
and then they're in TA, temporary accommodation, and they're expected to find something solid, permanent,
Mm.
or some sort of halfway housing,
Mm.
like within 28, 29, 30 days max.
Yeah.
And then that person, they might not have ever gone to, Centrelink or Housing Commission where they've had other people help or do that for them.
Mm.
And then they're out on the streets and trying to figure that out within a month. And
Yeah.
and I've just seen, a lot of situations, where they can go from bad to worse, and
Be
where
set
there
up to
should be a
fail.
lot more supports. 100%. It's
Yeah.
just systemic cycles, that
Yeah.
recidivism. It's nuts.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's much of like where my work and research comes in. I'm a huge advocate of, reforming electoral legislation within Australia to ensure, the franchise can be accessed by prisoners serving lengthy terms of imprisonment, and reform of the unsound mind electoral disqualification, because as you've just talked about, Jake, like they almost go hand in hand, our incarceration, and then also, issues with intergenerational trauma, issues, with having an intellectual disability. And so, yeah, I think, from my angle, when I talk about like political participation and, all this stuff with electoral law reform, I'm talking about, and I'm advocating for our people who are institutionalized and voiceless and powerless in this way, to at least at a bare minimum, if they choose to, they might not even trust the system and can't be bothered with it. But if they choose to be able to at least, select someone that's on the ballot if they're serving a lengthy term of imprisonment, or if they have intellectual disabilities, to choose someone and have the right support to choose someone on the ballot paper when it comes to election day, who might actually put skin in the game and actually politically represent their interests with law and policy reform to change the criminal justice system so that these things can start, changing for the better.
Boom. Righto. Solid words there. On top of that, stand by. Gonna share the screen. I want to show you this. And just give me your thoughts and feelings
Yeah.
after I play this. How you felt. Now, take me time to get this going. Righto. Gonna share this. This fella. Righto.
I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging, and on behalf of the Australian Labor Party, I commit to the Uluru Statement from the heart.
Okay. We're back. So, how did you feel when the new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, stood on the podium and those words come out of his mouth? Like, how did that feel for you as a strong Aboriginal woman, and just the line of work that you're in, and your thoughts and feelings of mob out there in general across the nation, this great land? How'd you feel?
Bloody relieved. You know what? When I first heard it, I was just in tears, and it was all happy tears because I just know how much work has gone into this campaign. And I know that my colleagues who I work with, they would be feeling, I knew what they would be feeling. I know, what my legacy to leave is, and I know what my purpose is, and I was just, I had a heap of different feelings come into sort of my mind as well. I thought, wow, my great grandfather would be so proud of this and so happy for this. Jack Patton. And then I thought, wow, all my mob, out at, Bar Youghal and in Grafton, and, people that I've worked with and met along the way, my family would be, ecstatic about this. But all these old people that have been just championing this work and this campaign, some of them have passed on now to the dream time, and some still live, but they're very old. And I was glad and really happy for them to be able to at least hear that coming from, the Prime Minister when he's first elected in, and that's the first thing he addresses in his speech.
100%. So we'll touch base again on this fella and the new crew that's coming through, as in the new government. But let's break down, because I just want to, so it's just clear for the listeners and the viewers, mob, doesn't matter if you're black, white or brindle, just the importance of the Uluru Statement and what it is, and then also where you come in, the contribution that you've had, because when you're talking about law and policy and reform, all of that. So if you can just break it down for what it is in its essence,
Yeah.
And then we'll elaborate a bit more.
Yeah. So the Uluru Statement, oh God, it comes after 2 decades worth of work, over 2 decades worth of work on, trying to come up with a resolution for this question, right? That really got kicked off in 1999 when John Howard took us to a referendum when he was Prime Minister. And there were 2 questions on the table. And it was, all right, will you vote yes? Like, would you accept symbolic recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? This wasn't word for word the referendum question, but it was symbolic recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in a statement within the Constitution, just at the front, and it would do nothing to our lives. It would just be this random statement that would exist. And then the other question was about becoming a republic, and that 1999 referendum failed. And so even though it failed, though, what remained on the table was this constitutional recognition question, right, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. But the form has changed over time. So what's remained the same since that moment has been the constitutional recognition, debate question. But its form has shifted from being symbolic, just put it in the preamble, first few pages of the Constitution to say that we're the first peoples to this country, the traditional custodians of it? Or do we take this opportunity and actually, go for structural reform? And when I say structural reform, I'm talking about having our own representative body, something like, similar to ATSIC, right? Or, the National Congress, having a representative body at a national level that can't be like other representative bodies in the past, be removed with a flick of the pen at the whim of the government of the day, right? And just be repealed through, because they're usually established through legislation, and so just ordinary legislation. So when they're established and the government, and then it challenges the government's views on things, be it law and policy reform issues about, any kind of issues we come into contact with as a peoples, and the government doesn't like it, what tends to happen historically in Australia is the government then, repeals the legislation, and then the body falls down and it's extinguished. And so we don't want that to happen again. And that was why the constitutional enshrinement of the voice is really important. But I'm getting ahead of myself.
Well, that's what I wanted to know. It's fleshing out also, is this referendum, is it,
Mm.
just advisory, or is it actually going to be,
Mm.
changing up when you're looking at policy and law?
Yeah. So, well, what happened? I'll just talk to the statement quickly first. So
Yep, yep,
ultimately,
yep.
all these years go past, and there's a lot of different work, a lot of different reports that happen, and then
And prime ministers.
yeah, and then there was that Recognise campaign that kicked off in 2015, which no one bought into, and you would have seen a big red R and people with shirts on walking around. And it was basically, an attempt from Tony Abbott at the time when he was our Prime Minister to, keep progressing with this recognition stuff. But Mob didn't buy into it because there was nothing on the table that, Mob viewed where that would change my life in a meaningful way. So no one bought into it. It didn't have any support, and so Indigenous leaders like Megan Davis, Noel Pearson, they ended up going to Kirribilli House and talking to Abbott and saying, we want a new process. We want to go out and actually do a good, thorough consultative process with Mob and ask them, how do you want to be recognised, if you even want to be recognised constitutionally at all? And
Yes,
so,
truth telling.
and so it, well, what happened was the regional dialogues were created. So he created a referendum council, and the referendum council then coordinated and designed the regional dialogue process. And basically, it brought together, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, traditional owners, and significant community representatives into a room together, and that was guided
And
by.
how's that chosen? Because, like, if you're looking at the map behind me, right,
Mm,
there's mobs from, so many First Nations groups within Australia.
mm,
So that's a tricky process when
mm,
it's trying to handpick people, individuals that I know there's going to be a lot of people that put their hands up and
mm.
want to be a voice, but it's also, being the right voice as well,
Yeah.
so that's, it would have been a whole tricky process, yeah?
Yeah, it has, and it's been a really contentious point on the way in which consultation's been done, I suppose, with you know developing and getting to the point where there's an Uluru Statement, because this is where the Uluru Statement comes from, right? Um, and there's a methodology of how people were chosen and why, and that's in if you go to the ulurustatement.org page and go to resources, you'll see the array of different reports that have been published over the last 10 years. But ultimately, this was actually guided by, you know, regions, communities, and their elders and traditional owners. And so the invitation list was actually, guided by and under by traditional owners and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders. Um, and so, but I can't speak to the detail of that kind of methodology because I wasn't on the referendum council, but my colleague, Professor Megan Davis was. And I think she talks about some of this in her work. But ultimately, what happened
That
is,
would have been so tricky, like trying to really define and narrow that down, but at the end of the day, like, they've got some good solid connections, mob network out there to really, you know, jump on the mic and have a say.
they did, and it was the first time we saw a process like this, where you know, there was elders, right, in the room, talking on the microphone with their interpreters standing next to them, and they're talking to other elders who couldn't speak in English, and then that interpreter would have to talk to the other interpreter, and they were communicating through interpreters in their own languages. And I'm like, I've never in my life and seen, you know, consultation happen in that way, and discussion, about really serious structural reform and key issues surrounding treaty, truth telling, and representation politically,
It's
happen in
almost
that
like a
way.
UN convention.
It really, and you know what? That's the way in which we have to think about First Nations across Australia. We're all sovereign people, and we all have our own different, laws and yeah, our own traditional decision making structures, right? And so it was paying, respect to that and showing a way in which you can do law and policy reform and consultation in a way that intersects with traditional governance decision-making structures, right? But anyway, all of that came into one in 2017, and it was this 3-day Uluru Convention. And there was a lot of discussion, debate about, you know, what do we need as a people moving forward, right? And what came out of there was the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It recognises some things that we've even discussed, in this podcast, which is, the over incarceration of our overrepresentation of incarceration of our people, and also the way in which our young people, our children, are, shoved into detention centres at alarming rates, and how that represents our political powerlessness, right? And that we want a better future. And so it talks about voice, treaty, and truth, and they're deliberately sequenced reforms that, I think in a really sophisticated way, Mob, showed how they understood the system and what they need from the system in order to be, sovereign, self-determining people that can interact with it and engage with it. And so the first was voice and constitutional enshrinement of it, so that we'd have a seat at the table when it comes to law and policy reform, on our affairs, and that it was protected by the Constitution. It would be harder.
That's our sovereign right.
Yeah. And the next was then treaty. And the idea was, all right, if we have the voice and we constitutionally protect it, it gives it political legitimacy. It gives it constitutional status. It has to be, ministers in Parliament will be compelled to, seek advice from this constitutional recognised body, right? And it can't just be taken away if the voice members challenge its views, the government's views. But that would be the starting point to enable us, Mob, to have the right amount of resources and the right amount of political power and legitimacy to go in and even the playing field when it comes to treaty negotiations. Because, Mick Dodson said this before, who used to be our Northern Territory Treaty Commissioner. He said, this will take decades to do. It is taking, years and years just to sort out the framework and the ways in which we even engage with the state as, sovereign peoples. And so
so much to work out.
It is a very complicated process, and we will need an enormous amount of resources to be able to negotiate, the terms of what a treaty will be. There's not one treaty in the world where sovereignty hasn't been given up, right? Something has to be compromised. And so that's why we wanted this political power and ability to, have immediate input to change law and policies, the criminal justice system, the Yukon Gorge and what happened there, to be able to intercept those decision-making processes to protect our culture, our cultural heritage and our rights, prior to waiting for decades and decades on end for a treaty, which even then wouldn't, it's an important thing to have, of course, but it doesn't function the same as what a voice does. So it wouldn't sit in Parliament and advise ministers. It's not going to be an immediate stop to our people going into, custody, whether it's detention or, whether it's adult incarceration. It wouldn't, change laws surrounding, our disenfranchisement and powerlessness when there's a huge amount of us that have disabilities, intellectual or physical, and so that all those types of changes come from law and policy reform. And that's what this immediate need that Mob recognised in the dialogues was about. They went, we want to change stuff now. We don't want to wait for decades on it. We want a treaty, but that will come next. And this thing will set us up to do that properly so that we have the best of the best silks representing us to go in and bat for us when it comes to that negotiation.
So what do the resources look like to you? And obviously you've talked and yarned up with a lot of Mob out there to really build that up, because there's going to have to be a lot when you're talking about resources from all types of different angles.
Definitely.
From all over the country to really make sure these voices are amplified, and also the correct messages are put down, and then you've got that policy and law and reform and everything else that rolls through it. So what do the resources look like?
Yeah, it looks like, having, top end silks to go in and, do the legal work that is required, to be able to properly negotiate treaties. That costs stuff. It'll be about, the costs for making sure mob, are invited to be a part through every step of the process. What
And can you explain to the listeners and viewers what silks, what that is,
Yeah,
what it
I'm
stands for?
talking about constitutional lawyers, experts, public lawyers. You want the top end, barristers that are in that space of Indigenous law issues, public law, but with a specific expertise on how to go about doing treaties, and these types of negotiations. We want those types of people to be able to obviously represent us, right? Because the government has an unlimited amount of resources, and so we need to look at our means, and um, who where's who do we need in the room, and who are the experts, to be able to properly go in and bat for us, and what other different support measures do we need, and there'll be a variety of different things that you'll call upon to do that, but it'll also take a lot of time to do that. These things don't happen. They will take decades. So you think about the amount of time, you think about the amount of identified stakeholders that would be involved in that amount of time in this type of process, and ensuring that you've got adequate funding to properly include mob and fly them in, bring them in for however long it takes to do this properly. Those are the types of resources you're going to need. A proper protected representative body that has all of that, the access to those things to do. And so you also need.
And would that look like, because if you're looking at, because you got mob that are working for, if it's, you got consultants, whether it's Aboriginal consultants that work with PwC and other mobs like that. So would it be consultation between, say, them and others? So it's sort of looking at trying to formulate how to best support that, and it's going to the government, like it's going to federal, national, states and territories, how to best draw resources to get mob to the table to get this across. And it's talking to people like yourself and other people that are involved within the law, so then you can sort of put dollars behind it to open it but keep it ongoing, because this is going to be huge.
It's going to be huge. And it will look like that. It'll look like, even simple as research assistance, and looking at, in different regions, the history of law and policies that have been, channeled out by state governments, that have been, directly, used to oppress us and dispossess us. And those will be ways in which we, further legitimize and argue our position with treaty terms that are to be negotiated. And so you look at it, I mean, the list is like almost endless, but there was an understanding of how this would work from dialogue delegates, and they, also wanted truth telling, but this sort of happened organically, just in conversations, and much of the focus was on the education system and how it doesn't tell the full truth about Australian history and who we are as a peoples. And there was
and that's where it starts with the youngsters. When you're looking about education, like you and I know, and a lot of listeners and the viewers know, coming through when you're coming into kindy, where it all starts there, and just really where you've got what teachers are putting out. But when we go back home and talk to mum, dad, aunts, unks, and you're getting that real truth, and then it's like you got conflicting messages, and you're like, what's the reality here?
Yeah, exactly. And so it was about doing that, but they did know, we do truth telling in a variety of different ways in Australia, and we have been for many years. There's reports, royal commissions that have been done in the past that have told the truth about our history, like the stolen gens. the Bringing Them Home report, for instance, the Aboriginal deaths in custody report, and yeah, so there's native title reports that also reveal elements of truth and who we are as a people, and so they noted those things.
That's so tricky. Oh, native title, yeah, and the struggle with that. Like, it is on all facets of Aboriginality, but
Yeah,
when you're talking about some
it's a very
lands
divisive
councils and
system.
other mobs, oh, jeez.
Yeah, and it's that's what it was, I suppose, designed to do. I mean, and this is another thing.
Because governments get threatened too when you got native title, and it's like, well,
Yeah,
those roads and these buildings, maybe they shouldn't have been there because you got X, Y, and Z, and then if you're looking at reclaiming certain situations, and then it can get all a bit messy. But
yeah,
oh, yeah, yeah, on all different levels.
very much so, very much so. Yeah, I think that system is, there's a lot of damage that system's caused in terms of, dividing different families, in different sorts of, areas, bits of land, nations throughout our country. And it's done a good job of doing that. And so that's another thing we need to be aware of when we're trying to come together, to negotiate treaties and working out how that's going to look. Are we negotiating treaties with each other? And that was something that was brought up in the dialogues. Some dialogue delegates were like, we need to actually have treaties with each other and heal first. And then we do it with the state, and then we do it with, the Commonwealth government, and so they saw these different tiers and, I suppose, like, priorities in this sequenced way of, we need to come together first. And that's largely because of the native title system. But yeah, it's I mean, the recognition of Albanese in his speech and the support, of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, it's obviously really welcomed from dialogue delegates and, everyone that's involved with the Uluru campaign. And
Yeah,
obviously,
and where do you see that? So you got Albanese, Prime Minister, new crew, and everybody else that's involved. So how do you see, now that we've got the new government in, and like what it stands for, like being Labor and obviously their ethos, but how is it gonna help our mob and the Uluru Statement from the Heart? Because it was pretty powerful what he said. Like, I got really emotional, and I know
yeah,
yourself, whole lot of host of people out there, but he was already starting to name some of our representatives,
mm,
before they were even sworn in,
yeah.
But so, how's this going to pan out, and the power that some of our people are going to have talking to government, getting things over the line? Where do you see it all rolling out?
I think, in short, I think we got this. I think, the time is now. Referendums, they're, heavily reliant on timing. And, that's why we say the time is now, because we've got the political support. We've got, even those in the LNP, ScoMo's party. There's support, even like Adam Bragg, within his party. And he has his supporters of the Uluru Statement. I mean, he came out with a book in full support, and gave formal acknowledgement to that. And so I think, what we might see is now a prioritisation from the Australian government under Albanese's leadership to progress with timetabling a referendum within the next year. And I think, Labor will really champion that with, different other campaign coalitions that exist, like the Uluru Dialogue, and there's, the mob up in Cape York from the Heart. And there's others out there that are all, coming together and really advocating for, this referendum to happen as soon as possible. And I think, at the moment, I think the LNP is in a bit of disarray after that last election. A lot of white men in the LNP lost their seats
Woo!
to independent women. And I think, for us, we need to basically, look at that situation of, political disarray and kind of galvanize on it. And yeah, and so we need to make the most out of that. And that's why I say timing's really important. I think that there'll be people that, you know, now more than ever would be walking across the floor in support of, you know, this Uluru campaign and pushing for a referendum that would go, to be clear, from a more conservative side of politics where you usually wouldn't see this kind of support. I'm saying now you're probably more likely to see people actually going, no, actually, I agree with this, and walking across the room to stand and support different motions that are passed through Parliament that aim to progress, you know, getting to a referendum for a voice to.
100%. And I'm glad that you did cover a lot of that when you're looking at some of the independents that had come through and a lot which were women. So that's where I want to talk about those misconceptions, you know. So when you're looking at, we all know with sport and a lot of black fellas, it doesn't matter if you're, you know, if it's on the footy field, a boxing ring, or a basketball court, like you got a lot of mob that'll just light it up, you know. And I get super proud of that when you're looking at 3% of the population and what we can do with sport and what that means to mob and people in general and how we represented it at its fullest. But it's so important, like looking at on the other side of the fence when, yeah, you got sport, but you're looking at academics and politics and yourself and strong Aboriginal females and males and what we can do now on in academia. So do you want to just run us through maybe some of the misconceptions there, because it's super important that that message is strong and follows through?
Yeah. Look, I'm an Indigenous feminist, so I step away from just being a feminist, and I'm a, you know, black feminist. And I talk about some of these issues when I talk about, you know, Aboriginal women in the franchise and Aboriginal women in prisons. And I think, you know, we need to have a really like concerted effort directed towards acknowledging, you know, our change makers that are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in this country and celebrate them. And I think a lot of us Indigenous women out there, you know, don't know the full history and truth about who they are and who we should be like, you know, celebrating and acknowledging. And you know, and maybe that comes down to, you know, the political culture and educational system, you know, from that's been heavily influenced from a white male's perspective. But certainly, you know, we've got some amazing and have always had some amazing Indigenous women in this space of change making, you know, be it Kathy Freeman when she's, you know, wearing the flag and, you know, winning the Olympics and the Commonwealth Games, or, you know,
Just wanted to say I was there and watched that, and God, the stadium was shaking.
even just watching the video always gives me goosebumps. Like, I just think she's amazing. You know, I look at, you know, seeing Jessica Malboy on TV, and, you know, and I love her
Yeah,
music,
the
and,
arts.
you know, and so I love seeing, you know, even on the news, like seeing our people on the news more and having NITV, you know, now, and our own channel. And, you know, I think the women in this space, and I mean, especially this Uluru campaign, Auntie Pat Anderson and Professor Megan Davis, you know, there's two strong Indigenous women who have really just stepped up and, you know, shepherded this whole reform and process, you know, through to where it is today. And then we have this, you know, Prime Minister starting out his speech acknowledging their work and the statement and what it represents. And I think, yeah, look, there's probably an underestimation of what we're capable of, you know, and that probably comes from probably a white male perspective. And there's a bit of a, you know, patriarchal issue, even interculturally, with us only celebrating, you know, our men. And acknowledging our men when it comes to senior positions, you know, in organisations, Indigenous organisations, or, you know, just, you know, even white institutions. And I think, you know, we have to also acknowledge, you know, those types of intersectionality issues and, you know, gender inequality issues that, us women face, and because we were at the bottom run, right? Like even when it
Well, bring that up, like, scream it, to the treetops, because
came.
it's massive when you're talking about that intersectionality. When you're looking at, you know,
Yeah,
First Nations, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, being a woman, having a disability, maybe, if it's gay, homosexual, like all
yeah,
that stuff going on. There's so many myriads, and then, and then the oppression and everything that goes on. So,
exactly.
and it's, yeah. And then you've got, and it's great seeing, Linda Burney,
Yeah.
like where she's at now and where it was already announced. But yeah,
Well, and
like,
Deary
let's run
McCarthy,
through it.
she's got one of the biggest electorates
Yeah,
in Australia, or if not the
shout out.
biggest. And she's amazing, and I think she's going to do, and she already has done amazing things. I love watching her advocacy, which is so fierce and staunch behind, pushing back on the cashless debit card. I love that she just calls a spade and calls it out. And I'm always, in admiration of their, confidence, but grace when it comes to challenging, not only the laws and the systems and the culture that exists around them in these political institutions, but also how they're, dominated by white men. And, I think it speaks volumes for their courage and bravery that they show and have within them to step up and do that for us. And I'd love for people to, really celebrate those types of successes more, instead of just only acknowledging Aboriginal women when it comes to our incarceration. And we're, the highest in the world incarcerated. So when it comes to Indigenous incarceration, it's high, yeah, but out of, even our cultures, like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, Aboriginal women are the highest yet again. And I just think, this screams to,
That's huge.
oh, but, culturally,
I can see the frustration coming from
yeah,
you. Like, sometimes you must feel like you're just
yeah.
beating up against a brick wall with a lot of circumstances, yeah?
Well, I look at, my aunties, and whenever anything, whenever shit hits the fan in community, you turn to your aunties, and you turn to, the elders that are, the women. At least from my community where I come from, it's the women calling the shots, and like, the men go quiet, and and they're great, and it's not to put them down, but it's the fierce, staunch advocacy and strength that comes through. That's what I remember, from my family and community, that, where the women step up when it comes to, native title discussions, when it comes to, I've sat in on dust disease board meetings as a young kid, and I've watched my mum, my nan, my aunties get up and, go, hang on a second, and really go toe to toe with, lawyers and other people in the room, and they go, oh, okay. And, and so there's things like that, those little nuances that happen when it comes to our decision making and, advocacy, that I don't think, many non-Indigenous people and culture just in general fully appreciate and acknowledge. Instead, we're just narrowly confined to, oh, there's an incarceration issue there. She's an Aboriginal woman, like, better not put her in front of the cops. And
Yeah.
it's
It's
just,
just set and forget.
it's limiting. And that's not the story that I want young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, kids, girls growing up and seeing. I want them to see more of the Kathy Freemans and Jessica Mauboys and Megan Davises,
Hey, and don't leave yourself out there too, Serious.
Yeah.
But so what would it look like? Because, where you're mixed in when it's got to do with law and research,
Mm,
and so a lot of that floats through because
mm,
we've touched on it, like, recidivism,
mm,
highest incarceration rates. So what could benefit, whether it's what's just been put out by the government now, or what your thoughts and feelings are, cultural components coming into
mm,
incarceration facilities, like what could be put in place to alleviate some of these numbers, because it's just nuts, like, and it's
mm.
got to be taken seriously.
Oh, definitely. First and foremost, we need, more funding for Indigenous organisations, services, you name it, you think about it, everything. We need more funding with everything. Like, But I think, having the right support services when you've got, mental health issues, when you've got, physical issues, whatever the issue is, we need support. And, we're confronted with the lack of funding and access to services, be it their existence or like people living remotely, who are unable to come into town. And, I know living out at Bayugal, it costs not many mob can, readily just be able to come into town whenever the hell they like and have, money for petrol to, and like even when you go to Grant,
Or to have a laptop or a computer and having a yarn like we are. Like, not everybody
no.
works that
What do
way,
they
you know?
expect us to have horses or something to just ride in and, or just, go and walk about or something and just end up in
That's the
town?
mindset still.
And so, I just think there's issues surrounding generally accessibility to the right support services that we need. I think there's also at the starting point too, measures that need to be taken to stop us from coming into contact with police. So, early intervention services, and support there. And I think they kind of go both hand in hand with what I just spoke about. Um, there obviously needs to be a lot more outreach, and I suppose co-design of, I suppose, the culture and things that will influence the culture within, the police force, at every level. So I think what I'm saying is they need to consult and engage more with community, to be able to set things up and train, police officers up enough to be able to properly engage in a really respectful way, and understanding way, in a compassionate way with Aboriginal people that and Torres Strait Islander people that come before them. Um, and there's things like that
And
kind of
we're in the
exist.
fold.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we're in the fold could, like you're talking about all
Mm,
these mechanisms. So, like, it's a lot of, because I know a lot of mob, whether it's rural or remote,
mm,
not everybody jumps on their phone or their laptop or their
mm.
PC, but just the power of see what we're doing now and having this yarn,
Yeah.
and just within the digital space. So,
Mm,
what can you see where mob can harness these platforms to make a difference with what you're talking about? So,
mm,
where these mechanisms can fold into place and where people can reach out more, to certain, if
mm.
it's people like yourself or if it's got to do with the police or all the different facets. So, where can the digital space really take effect?
I'm not sure if I understand this question. Sorry, Jake. So, like, is it what can mob do to sort of take advantage of the digital space to amplify advocacy for change?
Yeah,
That?
well, that's what I'm all
Yeah.
about. Yeah, so exactly.
Okay.
So you broke it down a lot better than I did. So yeah, it's really just having, yeah, so to
Yeah.
amplify, to broadcast, and just because there's all different mediums
Mm.
of the digital space.
Yeah.
So yeah, go.
I think, having, a podcast like what you have is great. But, it's hard for mob, to access the right stuff to be able to, do it and have enough time to be able to do these sorts of things. So I don't know, but maybe, community centres that exist within, like I know there's a community centre in Grafton, right? And there's like, people that work there to support like community and basically keep, especially those in really, disorder and dysfunctional situations. They work to kind of bring them in and provide a bit of happiness. So they do like barbecues and stuff and like, have basketball nights and things like that. So I suppose like looking at, ensuring spaces like that exist, for mob, in different townships, communities, and there's outreach even when there is a space physically for them, for those people to actually take, the right equipment and things out, resources out to community. So, mob don't always have to come into town for that because not everyone lives in town and can afford to get into town. But I think, a better
Yeah, because that's where
awareness.
I'm touching base
Yeah,
here. If they can't get out,
yeah,
so because mob either getting on the blower or if they can go face to
yeah.
face,
Like I would love
like
to
in a
see
medium like this.
I'd love to see more, communities have, I would love to see this rolled out across Australia, where there's like, a space with laptops and like, different digital IT bits and pieces. I'm not really tech savvy, so I wouldn't be able to tell you what the names are, but to have those types of resources, to be inspired not only to advocate for change, but advocate for change in a different way, like in a more evolved way, engaging with the digital space and being a creative with that. And I,
Yeah, it's so voices can be heard, because you might have someone out way remote and they've got all these functional ideas
yeah,
or whatever it may
yeah,
be, and and they don't have access to this.
yeah,
But imagine if they had, they could have been that next law reform maker,
totally.
or whatever it may be, to spread that cultural knowledge to get across to the new government or someone like yourself, and it gets amplified up the chain, and you're like, oh, where did this fella come from? Or
Exactly. They're
being
the
female or
experts.
male. Yeah, that's right.
Oh, I,
You know.
sit and listen to mob and community, a lot. And I'm just like, oh my God, like I wish they were in this room at this time, or they were, on this board at this time. And they're never given the chance. And I'm like, you know what? Ultimately, like proper representative democracy should look at ways in which, people are, they support people that go out to community, put up a screen, connect those people into parliament, and they're able to sit in on the right, committee meetings and be properly consulted with from the comfort of their own home, and have access to internet to be able to do so out in the bush.
Yeah.
And
That's it. It's like, oh, they've missed their plane, so we're not going to be able to hear their important message today. It's like,
exactly.
oh, hold on, boom, let's beam them in.
And we're supposed to be okay with Scott Morrison, when he was prime minister, calling the shots and wanting to create another Endeavour ship to travel around Australia, and that would have been like millions of dollars in expenditure and taxpayer dollars. And I'm like, well, hello, like there's all these other issues, and we know that there's a lack of political inclusivity of First Nations people on First Nations issues. Can't you at least start a process to better engage and digitally connect with mob that are out in the bush, out in the country, out in the bloody desert? There are ways in which you can do this. It's just a lack of political will and interest and advocacy to do so and create those things. But we need to be smarter in the way in which we understand representative democracy, particularly in 2022. There is no excuse to exclude people from the decision making table when it comes to any kind of law and policy reform. We live in a very digital era. There are things that can be made to provide better accessibility to people that are out in whoop whoop in the middle of nowhere with no
Well,
internet.
that's it, because Wi-Fi is getting sprawled out throughout the whole nation. So
Exactly.
in remote areas. So then it's enabling these people that digital accessibility
Yeah.
for people to be that voice, to make sure they're at the table. It doesn't matter where in
Speak
this
for
nation they are.
themselves. Yeah.
That's it. And I want to go into one of the nuances that you did talk about before, and I know we had a little bit of a yarn about it um, last week. But when you're talking about the youth dialogue delegates
Mm,
and and the development, because you're saying, like, because where you were talking about Indigenous women
mm,
being Indigenous, First Nations, feminist,
mm,
but where that I can see the passion that you've also talked about, having our young folk
mm,
having a seat at the table. So talk about the youth development and how important that
mm.
is, like for our next generation of leaders
Well, they're
coming through.
generational change. They are so important. I've always advocated for the voting age to be lowered, so that, because our median age, I think, as a people's is like somewhere around 21, 22, or 23. And so I'm like, okay, so, when I look at that in and of itself, I think we need to have our young people better engaged with. And I think they're passionate individuals. They've got some amazing ideas. They are always really super progressive and very confident and fierce little leaders in and of themselves. But I think it's important for us to be properly planning, like doing succession planning, right? And that's part of our culture anyway. Like, yeah, it's about passing on, that's what our old people do. They pass on all their knowledge as much as what they can over an entire, your entire life until you don't have them anymore. But they, sit with you. This is how I grew up. I would sit and listen to my grandparents talk, every day about native title issues, land rights, like, you know, the political disenfranchisement of our people, all the different Aboriginal representative bodies that have been taken away from us, issues with white fellas and, the Gungis, the police, that's Bundjalung for police. And, I'd sit and learn and listen to them. And then I started, coming up really young in my early 20s, full of confidence and passion and ready to go. And I'm like, but that's what it was all about. It was about equipping our young people with confidence, empowerment and knowledge and culture, to go out and, fight the fight, because, no one lives forever. And, but they're willing to do it. They just need, the right opportunities to be properly involved. And the youth dialogue, they do amazing work. It's co-chaired by Alira Davis and Bridget Karma, and again, two young Aboriginal women, co-chairing the Uluru. And they're fantastic. They're such intelligent young women. All they're doing constantly is looking for more First Nations youth to just keep, getting involved with the campaign efforts that we do with the Uluru campaign. But they also ensure that even younger people than them have the right knowledge of what's gone on in our history and why these things are important. And we do, like, full day workshops where we fly, Indigenous youth out from all different areas, remote areas of Australia, bring them into a room. Yeah, they sit and they watch different movies and videos and lectures, and they learn all about Black activism in Australia so that they can go out and be change makers themselves.
And what's it like for you? You're sitting back, you're watching all these youngsters, and they're coming from all different nations groups, and just seeing them interact, and just some of the different thoughts that they're having, and just where some of them can pave the way, or just, yeah, what's your thoughts and feelings when you're watching the new generation float through?
I'm so proud. Like, I just get really proud. I laugh, I chuckle sometimes because I can see my younger self in a lot of them, and I can see their frustration, and they're, reading something, in a newspaper, or they've seen something come across their Instagram and it's some sort of, news clip or whatever, and they're like, this is stuffed, like, what the hell? And I see their fight, and then I sort of step back and go, oh, this is going to be the next, um, Megan Davis or Arnie Pat or something. And but I laugh, and but I'm proud. It's great to see them so engaged, because I don't think people were as engaged when I was young. At their age, we'll say 5 years ago. No. But about 10 or 15 years ago, it was a kind of different climate, at least for myself. Like, we were engaged, but we were also, I think, a little bit more nervous because there wasn't this kind of large scale, political reform that was, coming up the line, and that was garnering all this different kind of support across the nation. That hadn't happened yet when I was their age. And so we had this passion, but we didn't know where to sort of place it and where it fit. And usually, more often than not, it didn't fit anywhere. Whereas now that they've got this reform to sort of latch onto in this campaign, it's really given them this platform and kind of focused direction to just kind of gun
Yeah,
for it, right?
I can see this more so now that, you got this government
Yeah.
that's rolled in and what they've announced. So
Yeah. And so I'm really excited. I think, we've got the numbers in terms of, everyday Australians, like, their support. We've got the political support. We're constantly polling, and, even though polling isn't entirely accurate, we do it nonetheless. And we've always had, amazing positive data that's retrieved from that kind of surveying of people. And everything now is about just putting it into action and actually, doing what needs to be done to get us to a referendum. But and sure, we'll keep campaigning, in the lead up to a referendum, and there'll be a no campaign and a yes campaign. But I think in terms of support and numbers, like even just now, like we've got amazing support, and I think all the work that the youth dialogue will do and the senior Uluru dialogue leadership, which I'm a part of, will do. It's only going to get better and better. So it's exciting times ahead. Like we're ready for it. History's calling.
Zip. It's calling.
Yes.
And talking about some of the work you're doing, right? So because this getting over the line, because you're saying you're going to have the yes and the no campaigns and everything in between, and say referendum gets rolled over, like, could you see degrees and research and all sorts of university-orientated law?
Definitely.
Like, what, from your professional point of view, what could come of this?
Oh, huge things. Even now, like, I mean, we're potentially at the start of like entering into a yes campaign for a referendum, right? And already there's different Indigenous law centres, getting established alongside the Indigenous Law Centre at UNSW, that are all, trying to garner support and, put in their own campaign efforts towards supporting the Uluru Statement and the voice to Parliament. So already on the ground, like at least, in universities, there's a lot of people that are advocating for this. They're integrating it into the way in which they teach law and constitutional law. A lot of universities across Australia have come out and said, made public statements and said, we support the Uluru Statement and a voice to Parliament. And so I think from that, there'll be, expert opinions called upon to support the work of voice members. Once the voice is established and it has, its representative members, there'll be, expert committees that are, created for, people from universities like myself, academics, to come in and talk to particular issues that they have expertise in. There'll be community doing that. There'll be, committees for the LGBTIQA plus community, youth, our elders. And there's a lot of work, to keep perfecting and developing the way in which we consult with one another and then engage with the state. So there's loads of work, academic work, to come out of this for sure, which is great.
That is awesome. Yeah. That is awesome. That's what I'm, be good to see. Like, off the back of this, that's just going to open up all sorts of doors, which is great. So hopefully this momentum just keeps on moving.
Yeah.
So is there anything else that you really wanted to sort of cover in regards to the Uluru Statement, or the important work that you're doing now, that you're continuing to do, or any other topic that you sort of want to float into the mix before we start wrapping it up?
Yeah, all I would say is, if you're listening and you're wanting to know how do you get involved with supporting the Uluru Statement from the heart, go onto our ulurustatement.org webpage, and we've got our different social media links, like our Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. We've got all those accounts on there, so I would click on all of those and follow them, because there's going to be a huge amount of campaign work that we're really going to rely on the Australian public to help us out with and walk with us, accept our invitation to just walk with us as part of a people's movement for this change. So we put out our updates on our socials all the time when things develop, and, we bring people along for the ride with explaining, breaking down in a really easy way, really complicated political issues and law reform issues. So take a look at our resources on our webpage, follow us on our socials, and, when you get a chance, write to your local minister. And we even have something to help you do that on our webpage if you head to ulurustatement.org. So that's what I would plug.
Great. You heard it there, folks. Come along for the ride. Dr. Dani Larkin, much appreciated for taking the time to have a yarn about this very important topic, situation, and breaking it down the way that you did. And there's going to be a lot of tireless work ahead, and good luck. And folks, you know how to support. Heard the socials. Appreciate the time. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Jake. It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Oh, that was my Siri talking on my watch, and ignore that. Thank you. See, folks, solid yarn, eh? With Dr. Dani, and just breaking down that Uluru Statement, what it is, what it represents. Oh, she's very insightful, very knowledgeable, and great just to see her trajectory. And not just the work that she's done, but what she's going to continue to do. Helping a lot of mob out there. Solid work. And if you like the podcast, hit that subscribe or follow button. And we've also got a Patreon page. The link is within the description. So if you want to roll with the squad and become a patron, that'd be great. And if you want to get in contact with me, you can get me via Instagram at streetrollandcheetah, or email, one word, streetrollandcheetah@gmail.com. And we've also got a Facebook page, Keep Rolling with Jake Briggs, so check it out. And want to thank our sponsors, Permoville Australia, the greatest electric wheelchairs in the land. Wouldn't be sitting in anything else but these 4 wheels right here, and they've got great assistive tech also. So righto, we'll see you on the next one.